Hello again. Okay, so it's okay. Environmental treaties. Everyone ready? Good to go? So over the past 25, 30 years, environmental treaties have demonstrated some clear strengths. As we detailed before, they represent the main apparatus of how we manage the environment and environmental issues. And we see this as this kind of like the sheer number of sign-ups as the years have gone on since 1973. With many policies becoming hugely popular in terms of the signatures and the signatory states involved. They also lead to the creation of regimes. Now, a regime is important. A regime can be understood as a dominant set of principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures and processes in which actors' kind of motives and hopes and expectations converge. Okay, so informally we understand a regime as an understanding held collectively about what is appropriate behaviour. So for example here, we are in a context, in a regime of a university where we are well aware that I am here to stand here and talk, and if I leave, that is not acceptable behaviour of someone who has been asked to come and teach. Formally, they come in terms of laws. International law, particularly related to kind of diplomacy, for example, but also international agreements. So a regime in international law may involve the respected right of a diplomat to carry a case which is not necessarily searched. That is a regime in terms of international diplomacy. In the environment, an international agreement and international law is related to the treaties I've just discussed. But it's based around not just us knowing collectively what is right and what is acceptable, but it being enshrined in some piece of legislation or agreement. Both can shift governments' policies. No one is better than the other. But the absence of a regime often results in a lack of kind of consensus and agreement about an issue being an issue and how to solve that issue. Norms and regimes redefine what appropriate behaviours are and shape how states behave. And this goes back to the discussion of Kyoto. And although Kyoto, as an actual piece of policy, did not do what it set out to do, it created a regime when it was seen as acceptable, valid, and necessary for states to engage in that form of international collaboration. However, the primacy of treaties in international environmental policy can create issues as well. They are slow to negotiate and ratify. International negotiations, particularly related to climate change when they're global, must accommodate the differing views of as many as 190 different governments at any one time. That's hard. There are different expectations, different red lines, different negotiation styles, different tactics, and as a result, negotiations can often be excruciatingly slow. You know, sometimes a decade passes between when an issue is established as an issue, when the international community begins to mobilise, and when the treaty is finally signed and goes into action. Linked to this need to balance the differing views of so many states is the resulting compromise. treaties are forged by consensus. So compromises are to be expected, compromises are good, compromises ensure that a policy addresses wider issues, speaks to all parties. Compromises are key in environmental policy in particular. Now, when I started working with the Environment Agency, one of my colleagues gave me the best bit of advice about policy, which I will gladly pass on, which is environmental policy is not just about making everyone happy. It's about making everyone equally unhappy. It is about compromise. However, compromise with so many different actors often leads to the lowest common denominator. Okay? So where ambitious goals and mandated targets and firm timelines are removed or diluted and lost and made less concrete because we have to keep everybody happy. The result is that an international treaty often looks very different from how it started. One of the biggest issues with the majority of the international treaties I've discussed is a lack of monitoring, a lack of enforcement and a resulting lack of compliance. A high percentage of treaties do not mandate states to monitor their compliance. Nor do they mandate states to measure the impact of any actions that they have. Okay, so the Basel Convention, again, contains very little on both how states should dispose of hazardous waste, but also doesn't contain any provisions of how the movement of waste should be tracked within a state. Again, this lack of provisions for enforcement as well. In terms of multilateral agreements, it is perhaps not very surprising that enforcement is weak. Okay, so in large part, international environmental treaties rely upon this trust again. They are an honour system with little, if any, accountability other than public pressure. And that highlights an importance of international organisations and civil society, for example, who are very often the organisations applying the pressure, but also monitoring non-compliance and publicising non-compliance. And one of the shames about my 3 days with you is that I'm not going to talk about the role of civil society in terms of monitoring and enforcing these treaties, but I just want to highlight how important they are, particularly when it comes to these treaties working. But then there's a lack of technical and financial resources in many states, which often result in states' failure to carry out the responsibilities as agreed. We've seen this being addressed in more of a growing kind of discourse and agreement regarding technology transfer. So I mentioned earlier the INDC for India, who were very savvy, very good, very clever, who split their INDC into 2 parts. 1, if they had no international assistance, and 2, if they had international assistance, including the transfer of solar panel technology from the United States. They stuck to that position throughout the Paris Climate Summit and achieved their aims. But there's a growing awareness of a need for countries to share technology when it comes to particularly renewable energies. Okay, so there's additional forms of coordination as well, which I want to highlight. Global environmental governance is not just based around states. I'm talking about states a lot at the moment because they're still our primary unit. So governance is understood as regulation and decision-making in which actors other than states participate. In other words, it's transnational rather than international. Inter being among national governments in multiple countries, transnational being among NGOs and non-governmental actors. In In essence, a relative failure of the UNFCCC has resulted in states, although being the primary actor, not necessarily speaking for everyone in terms of climate change mitigation and policy. Key actors other than national governments include scientists and researchers, multinational firms and industries, environmental NGOs, civil society, subnational governments, cities, municipal governments, all have had growing influence in recent decades. Like an example of this can be seen at COP22, which was held in Marrakesh in 2016. Okay, and at Marrakesh, a number of world leaders openly called for businesses, regions, cities, industries, NGOs, and universities to showcase their climate activities with partners in other states to empower and help others have a low-carbon transition. In doing so, state government actors highlight how there are other routes available. These routes include a traditional route, which is influencing the treaties we discussed about, monitoring them, enforcing them, using this soft power and investigation to highlight and illuminate when there is non-compliance. But there are other things to do as well. Partnerships between organisations, collaborations, voluntary codes of conduct, campaigning, pressure, scientific research, discussing environmental policy every step of the way. One of the most important things you can do when it comes to climate change is to talk to people about climate change. But this also addresses an additional problem, which is how the state international system can often result in a standstill. States can often refuse to coordinate. So, states may refuse to coordinate based on a number of reasons. Okay, but refusing to coordinate, when I use that, I mean either refusing to act, just saying no, or acting without coordination. So there's two different routes of that. Now, powerful states can often perceive an issue in environmental policy because it affects their interests. And then powerful states may use their resources to shape others' decisions, be it through the provision of a carrot, as in an incentive, or a stick, as in a penalty. There may be side payments in other domains, through be it foreign trade, trade agreements, security arrangements, anything like that. But it's important to understand why states may not be part of international agreements. Why was the USA not party to Kyoto? Why did Canada withdraw? Why has Donald Trump withdrawn from the Paris Agreement? Why is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil threatening to do the same? Now, this could be down to the degree that a country is an externaliser or an externalisee, a polluter or a non-polluter. If a country has a high level of emissions, it makes sense that they may not want to have to invest the time, energy and resources to reduce those emissions. There may be additional variables at play as well. Debt or development priorities or globalised industry being present within the state. Now these, in terms of environmental policy, the implementing of new environmental safeguards or targets will often have economic costs for a country. And this may affect domestic industry, which may be particularly important or powerful within a state. So states can become climate leaders or climate laggards and, in essence, not engaging in the coordination, based on an interplay of not just environmental facts, not just whether a state is upwind or downwind or upstream or downstream, but also the economic impacts of action or inaction. And then also the ways that political audiences nationally or domestically may perceive environmental policy. Now these basic kind of factors are influenced by so many things. Policy styles, party politics, bureaucratic structures, transnational linkages, popular memory. And interests and preferences vary from state to state, with constellations of other interests and priorities caring about different environmental issues. And all of these have to be factored in when seeing how states negotiate at the international level. Because when a state goes to negotiate, and I'm sure you've done some form of negotiation exercise here, you're not just thinking about the environment. You're thinking about the people back home, party politics, popularity, the potential for support, and then the economic costs of action or inaction. Now we see this playing out. We see this playing out in terms of how international negotiations work. National governments set their priorities and strategies before they go. They negotiate, often through politicians, but mainly through trained negotiators. And there's a use of bracketed text. When each group, each stakeholder, each negotiator goes through sentence by sentence agreeing on whether that works for them. They sign and they ratify, but importantly in negotiations, there is always a linkage of issues. In environmental policy at the international level, a sentence within the Paris Agreement, for example, is never seen in exclusively environmental terms. It is seen in political and economic language by those negotiating. There is nothing more powerful in a negotiation than one negotiator saying to another, my constituents or my superiors will not accept that. And that gets said quite often. Negotiations as a whole are two-level games, okay? Yeah, so Putnam's two-level games. National negotiators at Paris, at Katowice, at Kyoto, at Rio, have to satisfy two different groups. They are subject to two different pressures. They need to satisfy their foreign counterparts by ensuring that an agreement is reached and is signed. But they also need to appeal and please national politicians and interest groups. Because if they come back home with an agreement which doesn't fit the interests and the motives of those actors, it will not be ratified. And it'll be unsuccessful. This results in numerous resources, but almost numerous constraints. So the threat of non-acceptance from one constituency, one group, can help gain the support from another. By saying my superiors will not agree to that, provides leverage. And I want to give a very quick example of international coordination in progress. I've been looking back and I want to kind of talk about now. And is red, so reducing emissions through land degradation and deforestation. Have you studied that here? Yeah? Cool. So I can skip the first slide. So the policy dilemma here is we need to mitigate the undesirable impacts of climate change, but we also want wood and land for other purposes. It was first negotiated in 2005, and most of the key RED decisions and playbook was completed by 2013. The rule book was finally confirmed in 2015, so it's quite an emergent policy. So the basic idea of RED is that the cost of deforestation for the climate vastly outweigh the benefits. But there are financial incentives for us to deforest. And we need a global framework to kind of change those incentives, alter them, outweigh them. So the idea is that developed countries will pay developing countries to reduce deforestation. But there are a number of social questions on the ground in states which are subject to these payments, which create issues for RED as an international policy. Firstly, who will be paid to not cut down the trees? So legal land ownership in many of the tropical forests and landscapes is often unclear. It is customary, it may be held by traditional communities, indigenous groups. And questions of forest governance and ownership are tied to wider historical and political questions related to who owns the land and their livelihoods. So as a result, there's been opposition against RED in a number of areas because by paying someone not to deforest a part of the landscape, an agent of RED is confirming that that person has ownership over that land, circumventing historical struggles, but also likely creating a new injustice in terms of who governs that forest. In addition, it could also be at risk of corruption, the appropriation of payments by the powerful landowners, as well as the marginalisation of local communities. You may find that communities, in some cases, can be removed from their land as part of this process. We've seen this in places like Madagascar, where RED projects have resulted in the disruption of livelihoods of traditional communities, with them being moved from the land, which has become a protected forest. An irony, really, considering that these people are usually the best equipped to look after a forest like that. So there's a need for safeguards, and this is what's arising here. A need for us to safeguard other people and other communities throughout this process. And then the second question when it comes to a criticism of RED is that how do we ensure that old growth, historical forests are not just still chopped down and replaced with monocultured, artificial, designed areas of woodland? How can we also ensure that other ecosystem services are not damaged by this scheme? What of water quality? What of water security downriver? The financial incentives of RED are exclusively tied to carbon. Then, biodiversity concerns can be taken into, not be taken into consideration, they can be forgotten. Forests are not just stocks of carbon, they have numerous benefits for everyone else. They have these positive externalities for the communities living there. Livelihoods, biodiversity, the protection of water resources. RED needs to take these into account. So as a result, there needs to be this continuous redevelopment of policy. Because what we see here is a scheme being designed at the international level by state-led representatives in civil society, not directly translating to the community level. The people who designed RED and the RED rulebook did not envisage these issues necessarily, nor did they not care about them. There's an unintended consequence to a policy. But one of the key ways that we see state interests interacting with international environmental policy in a negative way is through this kind of dichotomy of environmental protection versus economic competitiveness. And I was talking to someone about this in the break, and I can explain it to you as red versus green. Red for the Labour Party in the UK, this protection of kind of living standards, this moving against inequality, this need for development, versus green, the environment itself. There is a deemed tension between environmental protection and a tendency for states to continue to promote economic growth. This is not news. No, I'm not kind of breaking the mould here. In times of crisis, focus on growth may be intensified. And that's something we saw in post-2008, post-2009, when we saw this increased focus on development and industrialisation and economic growth. As a country grows richer, it has, well, have you come across the environmental Kuznets curve? Yeah? Kuznets curve? I've got chalk. Come across that? Yeah. Yeah? Everyone? Yeah? Yeah, cool. Okay, so the argument that as a country develops, it will be more likely to pollute. However, it reaches a point when rising public awareness of the environment, of pollution, of degradation, of the impact and the footprints that we leave behind will result in a changing consensus reducing environmental impacts. Okay, so that is traditional understanding of how economic growth and the environment interact. And we see this need for countries to get to this point evident in international negotiations, particularly in terms of these discourses and concepts of the right to develop, of economies in transition. But this is debated. And it's debated for a number of reasons. Not just economic growth, but globalisation and foreign direct investment. These flows of finance across the globe. How does it fit in? How does globalisation fit in? This movement of business across state boundaries. Because we've already seen at some points in the past couple of days that environmental protection may add to the cost of doing business in a country. If you go to your command and control regulations of a total ban on a polluting part of your industry, there will likely be companies which do not move to your country, or countries which move away. And we're seeing this currently in the US. This discussion of a need to ensure that regulation does not impact economic competitiveness. The environmental protection cannot come at the cost of environmental competitiveness. Donald Trump's administration has rolled back a number of environmental safeguards, primarily based on the need to deregulate. Does red tape translate into Russian? Cutting the red tape, yeah? It's a British saying of getting rid of all the bureaucracy, all the regulation. It gets in the way. We're seeing this in the United States. No, there's more. And more again. The argument is that by regulating business, we force business to move elsewhere. Why would a business stay in a state when it is heavily regulated and its costs are increased due to environmental policy and regulation? Why would it stay there and it can move somewhere else where that regulation is not translated? Where it's not in place? And this is in many ways, the pollution havens hypothesis, which is that firms favour countries with fewer environmental regulations. That a country setting policy at a lower level than is globally the norm will likely be able to entice in all these other companies. It shows that there are benefits of pollution in terms of jobs secured, goods or services produced, and these are obvious, and these are held, and these are shared. Now, slightly different but still linked to the pollution haven argument is a race to the bottom. It's a similar but a slightly different concern, particularly related to development economics. Perceptions of economic disadvantage will likely force state governments to deregulate as a way to be competitive again. In short, if country A implements a deregulation process which strips away environmental safeguards in the chemicals industry, country B will look over the border, see how well they're doing, not want to miss out, and conduct the same act of deregulation. We often see times of economic recession, be it perceived or real, leading to a loosening of environmental standards, and this can be understood as a race to the bottom as well. Now, pollution havens can only really rise from the country's institutions. They're the ones who set the standards. And as a result, it raises questions about the individuals who are part of government and the bureaucracy. Are they biased against environmental policies? Do they come from business background? How powerful is business in that state? Is there corruption? Is there rent seeking? Is there a capture of the regulatory bodies by certain actors, such as the private sector? But then as well, if there's a country which is reliant upon capital tax for revenue, so the taxing of companies for revenue, the state government will be much more likely to listen to the companies and follow the path that they want, out of fear of losing revenue from those companies. Now back to Trump, because this is key and this is a concern currently, is that as he continues rolling back environmental protections, that other countries may do the same. Because they will see that the US is reducing the legislation against mercury poisoning in water, and understand that that will lead to a process of companies moving to that state. They won't want to miss out. This is key, okay? And pollution havens have a knock-on effect. Pollution occurs in a transboundary manner, but so can policy. Neighbouring states may also seek lessened regulation, having seen the success of their neighbour. Now, I haven't been able to load this video, so I'm sorry. But I will talk to you about the town of Goyu in China, which is where quite a lot of our laptops in Europe and North America have ended up. Okay, so according to United Nations data taken from 2 or 3 years ago, 70% of electronic waste in the globe ended up in China. Much as e-waste came through channels which are technically illegal under the Basel Convention, because there is a specific ban on this transfer of waste. And particularly now there is a specific ban on a transfer of waste which is hazardous from the United States to China and Vietnam. Lax regulation, lax monitoring, lax enforcement allowed this to prosper. I'm going to go on a safe assumption that none of us in this room have ever recycled a laptop, but the impacts are huge. In Goyu, it was like a cottage industry, a family-run industries across the city. They would melt down the batteries of your laptop. This creates fumes, which are highly damaging both to the air in the town, but also the health of those doing it. Goyu, 2 or 3 years ago, was a mess of spare laptop parts. Laptops piled up, computer systems piled up. The town was based around this trade. However, this report and others like it embarrassed the Chinese government, and Guangdong's regional government approved a plan to force all of the recycling workshops to move into a proposed industrial park. This is important because before that, people were doing it in their homes. All the e-waste recycled had to go through this park. That was enforced. Okay, there are now 29 big recycling operations in this industrial park. That 29 stemmed from 1,200 home-based workshops. Over 1,000 households were engaged in this activity. Over 1,000 households were exposed to the health risks of our laptops being recycled and exported across the globe to do so. The pollution haven hypothesis is contested by numerous different economists. The argument is very often that pollution havens do exist, but exist for a very short period of time. And we see this with Goyu and China generally, is China in the past 2 years has restricted all imports of recycled goods from the USA and Europe. This is for a number of reasons. Concern for the environment may be one of them, but also the fact the sheer volume of goods being exported is becoming quite high. And just as a quick aside, the UK has no idea what to do with its recycling at the moment. Nor does the US. It's piling up. There are concerns in the UK that some councils will return to landfill for even recyclable goods. Such is a reliance on these cross-national flows of goods. Alternatively, there is the pollution halo hypothesis, which is a reversal. Okay, so the argument is that companies will be very happy to move to states where there are high environmental standards. Free markets create that competitive atmosphere when states and companies will be looking to be green, to be environmental. And reverse the pollution haven hypothesis, a country B looking at country A having more stringent regulation and a better environment may want to do the same. There's a growing argument at the moment that the environment and democracy do not fit. That we don't have long enough, that there are too many concerns, too many difficulties when it comes to implementing policy. And that the inherent tension between state priorities, popular priorities and environmental protection will be difficult. Environmental thinkers as a whole have been drawn instinctively to ideas of democracy for a better, a greener future. And sustainable development as a whole has emphasised the need for inclusive policy to allow everyone to have a voice and a say. But tensions do exist. And full disclaimer, what I'm going to present to you today, I don't necessarily agree with. It's just an important part of knowing the role of the state and the international system in environmental policy currently. One source of tension can be found in procedural and substantive democracy. Procedural democracy is the staging of elections, it is the electing of representatives, the knowing of the processes of how we run our state are democratic. Substantive is different. It is about equal participation. In many liberal democracies, debates over climate change have become highly politicised, with powerful lobby groups and vested interests taking advantage of substantive democratic political systems to push particular agendas and advance their interests. If I was to try and meet with my MP, I probably would take quite a long time to meet with them and discuss environmental policy. However, I imagine if there is a company who employ a large number of people concerned about environmental regulation in the UK, they would be likely to see someone a bit quicker. A second source of tension can be found in the competition, the contest currently between science, people and policy. Scientific elites discuss, research and frame environmental issues. They provide policymakers with the tools to convince groups that environmental regulation is necessary. They talk about climate change. They tell people about climate change. They communicate what the impacts are. However, we see that very often climate change is politicised to such an extent that it's seen as a left versus right or a science versus people debate. A red versus green debate. An environment versus the economy debate. Now here is when I get a bit interesting, because in response to these tensions, people have asserted a number of different routes. Okay, first, more non-state actors, regional governments, municipal governments, NGOs and civil society, commercial companies, private companies. Ecological democracy and the green state, which can be understood as the need to take the environment into account in every decision as a stakeholder. So the environment is also a constituent of policy. And importantly, one of the growing awarenesses now is about environmental authoritarianism. And I will be honest with you, I have been surprised at Bristol every year because more and more students are quite keen on environmental authoritarianism. Environmental authoritarianism believes that authoritarian regimes, or strong state governments, are best equipped to unilaterally devise, implement and manage environmental policy. An authoritarian response will allow for the protection of the environment at all costs. Climate change mitigation needs massive, rapid shifts in energy and infrastructure provision. And the argument is that only an authoritarian government can actually meet this demand. As an example, who can tell me, according to The Economist, the UK outlet, so it's got that agenda, who can tell me what is the most successful national policy in terms of reducing the atmosphere's stock of greenhouse gases? There's one state policy which is understood to have had one of the biggest impacts on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. No? Apparently, it's China's one-child policy. Now, bear in mind That one, this is The Economist, so it comes with a particular liberal democratic kind of agenda. 2, that a number of the policies up there are still very much in process. And 3, that we're not necessarily sure where all this information has come from and how the calculations are made. And 4, actually, China's one-child policy may prove to be incredibly environmentally sustainable, but it has not proved sustainable in terms of Chinese political interests because it has now become a two-child policy. There is a wide kind of discourse in the UK when the most important thing you can do to address climate change is have one less child than you would originally hope for. This stems from the same kind of direction and thought process. But the argument here, and again, I do not share it, is that for such a huge change, for the implementation of taxes, for changes of our behaviour, there needs to be more enforcement. And environmental authoritarians argue that that enforcement can only come from a very strong state. This is also disputed because we often find countries calling for greater participation and transparency in government because people are generally seen to be becoming more environmentally conscious and more in favour of climate change policies. And if they have an equal say, it will likely lead to the election of governments and policymakers who share those opinions. But what this shows the most is how the role of a state and how we make environmental policy is still open to various disputes. Everyone in this room has a different vision of what a sustainable future is. It's different to the person sitting next to you. We all think of sustainability in different terms. We have different priorities. We have different policies. We have different routes forward. Some of you may be looking at this and thinking, yeah, fantastic idea. Others may be absolutely terrified at the thought. But what it shows is that environmentalism is currently going off in so many different directions, with so many different visions, that there is a complexity here that we need to take into account. But it also shows that the state remains a key actor, regardless. Because it's either less democracy or more democracy. There is no threat to the state in contemporary environmentalist kind of understandings, but its role is becoming increasingly questioned. It needs to evolve, it needs to find new avenues and challenge new pressures. Particularly when you come to the idea of the United States currently, because Donald Trump, when he announced that the US was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, said, I'm the president of Pittsburgh, not Paris. Several hours later, the mayor of Pittsburgh went on the TV and said, I'm the mayor of Pittsburgh, and we're staying in the Paris Agreement. We're seeing this emergence of new different actors coming in. We're going to talk about some more tomorrow. But the reason why I'm ending on this, about this kind of different vision, this different understanding, is I want to talk to you about tomorrow's task. So tomorrow we're going to be talking, in the morning I'm going to be talking. I'm going to be giving a lecture on green capitalism and then contested sustainability, which is where my research is, which is what I concentrate on the most. So I'm looking forward to that. And then in the afternoon, I can't remember the time, but I think you all have a syllabus, and it will tell you in that. We will be meeting, and I'll be handing over to you. I'm going to ask you, between now and then, to look through the INDC of Russia. It's a short document, don't worry. It's not going to take a lot of time. There are copies of it in both Russian and in English on the shared email address, as far as I know. Look through it, get to know it, But notice how it doesn't really give many directions of what route will be taken. There's no problem with that. In my opinion, the aim is achievable and will likely be achieved. But what I want to know is this. How can you see that sustainable future being reached? At universities, we often get you to do simulations and negotiations when you represent someone else, when you kind of hide behind the views of a politician or a company or a community group. Tomorrow you're going to be telling me what you think should happen. You are a stakeholder in climate change. You are an environmentalist in some ways. But we all have a different understanding of what a sustainable future should be. So in the workshop tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to be asking you to sit down with each other in small groups and talk through different policies that you propose. Do you think we need to apply 100% tax on all new cars bought in this country? Do you think that we need to have an enforced vegetarianism of all members of the population? You might do, and that's fine, but you'll have to tell us why. How can you encourage this transition? How can you encourage people to use public transport more? How can you encourage people to eat less meat? Is that all clear for tomorrow? Yeah? And, I do this with my students in Bristol, and I'll give you the same advice that I give them every time. There is no such thing as a right or a wrong policy. There is a thing as a good or a bad argument. Okay? So think about it, see if you can find more information. Has this been taking place elsewhere? Has it worked? If not, how not? Are there any questions for me before I hand over to you to discuss some readings? Yes?
About the thing in China,
Yeah.
All the waste of the computers, how did they actually manage all that waste in China?
They didn't really, that's a short answer. How did they manage it afterwards or during?
No, how that's waste coming from the European Union and the United States, right?
Yeah.
If it's illegal, because there is an international treaty about the disposal of waste,
Yeah.
or it should be waste. How did it actually arrive with that waste in China? Like there is no control?
There was no control. There was lax regulation, lax compliance monitoring, lax penalties. There was.
There is
I imagine it arrived as normal.
It's normal.
Yeah, in a shipping container, like everything else, even in the legal market. Like now it's formalised, and it's going to be likely cancelled and restricted. But no, it did just arrive on the in illegal channels. But when there is lack compliance and monitoring, illegal channels very closely resemble legal channels. Any other questions for me? Yes.
What do you think about the rise of right-wing politicians in countries around the globe? Like we have Brazil, the United States, Italy, to some extent, Greece. What kind of implications does it have for the particular policy of these countries and the world?
I'm very concerned about the rise of right-wing politicians across the globe, and that is in environmental terms too. We often see this kind of dichotomy, this debate between the economy and the environment playing out a lot in right-wing discourse. And I'll give you the example of Bolsonaro because that's what I study, that's where I work. Bolsonaro has come in under a very right-wing kind of manifesto, which is not just based around exclusion of minorities, but is also particularly based on opening up the Amazon region for more industrial activity. That is mining, that is deforestation, that is soy and beef farming. He's been in office for 100 days, and he has already removed several key parts of environmental legislation in that country. The rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil doesn't just threaten the Amazon rainforest, but because the Amazon rainforest is a key source of kind of reducing carbon emissions as a carbon sink. It represents a direct threat to the Paris regime and to climate change policy in general. That's just Bolsonaro. Factor in wider kind of industrialization and deregulation in the United States, it becomes part of a wider issue. In the Australia, I'm going to make a disclaimer here, I'm not calling any Australian politician fascist or right-wing. Well, some of them are quite right-wing, but we see the rise of an Australian conservative political group which is based around the expansion of coal mining. Again, this is for economic growth. So this rise of right-wing politicians at the moment, in my mind, is directly linked to a rise of economic development based on extraction and therefore based on pollution. Anyone else want to kind of like bait me into saying something offensive to Australians? No? Now, there was a set of readings which was distributed. Has everyone managed to have a look through? Yeah, people are nodding. Please can you distribute yourself into groups of 2 or 3 or 4, with this 4 here, and discuss what you read, whether you agreed with it, why or why not, and whether you think it's worth other people reading. Is that clear? Yeah? If you have any questions about the text, about the lecture, or about me as a person generally, please feel free to put your hand up and I will come running. Okay? Over to you. You can talk to each other, please do.